what can go wrong when only a few hundred meters remain to the summit? When the weather is favorable, the route is set, and the team is ready. In 1934, German climbers learned the answer to this question on the slopes of Nanga Parbat, a mountain known for good reason as the Mountain of Sorrows. And this answer turned out to be far more terrible than one could have imagined. But before we get to the story itself, it's worth understanding what this place is all about. The name Nanga Parbat translates from Urdu as Naked Mountain. The local population calls it more simply Diamir. Among climbers, it earned the grim nickname Mountain of Sorrows, and the reason is clear. The number of climbers who have died here is staggering. It is the westernmost peak of the Himalayas, located in the Kashmir region. Its height is 8,125 meters, the 9th highest in the world. It would seem there are higher mountains, but it's not just about the altitude. In terms of technical difficulty, Nanga Parbat is considered one of the most challenging peaks on the planet. Several factors converge here that turn an ascent into a game of Russian roulette. Extreme differences in elevation, unpredictable weather, vertical walls with nowhere to rest, and avalanches that strike without warning. The southeastern slope, known as the Rupal Face, is a near-vertical surface 4,500 meters high. Imagine, you stand at the base and look up. The wall rises into the sky at an almost right angle. It is one of the largest and most dangerous faces in the world. On certain sections, like the Merkel Couloir, the steepness reaches 90 degrees. There are no gentle slopes where one can catch a breath, only rock, ice, and the void below. The statistics speak for themselves. In 2011 alone, 64 people died on the mountain. Over the entire history of ascents, more than 400. Every rock here remembers a tragedy. Every glacier, a grave. But despite this, the mountain remains popular among climbers. There are two reasons. First, it is a serious and prestigious achievement in the world of mountaineering. To summit Nanga Parbat is to join the elite. Second is its relative accessibility in terms of logistics. What does this mean? Take, for example, K2. To reach its base, one must travel hundreds of kilometers through difficult mountain terrain. This requires Sherpas, guides, and yaks to transport gear, thousands of dollars and months of travel. Every extra kilogram of cargo means additional costs and risks. The situation has improved now, of course, but in the past, reaching such peaks was truly difficult. An expedition could take half a year just to get the base camp established. Nanga Parbat, on the other hand, is relatively close to populated areas, which significantly simplifies organization and saves enormous amounts of money. One could say the mountain allows for a closer approach than other 8,000ers.
But this doesn't make it any less dangerous. Quite the opposite. This accessibility is deceptive. The first attempt to climb this 8,000er was made back in 1895 under the leadership of mountaineering legend Albert Frederick Mummery. He was a man whose name was known to every climber in the world, experienced, strong, fearless. But his expedition ended in tragedy. 3 climbers were swept away by an avalanche. In an instant, the men disappeared under tons of snow. Mummery became Nanga Parbat's first victim, the first, but far from the last. After that, the peak did not attract much attention for several decades. The memory of the tragedy was too fresh. The mountain seemed to be waiting. Until, in the 1930s, the Germans turned their gaze toward it. In fact, Nanga Parbat is often called the German peak. Perhaps no other nation has shown such a persistent, almost maniacal interest in it. German climbers were obsessed with this mountain. This would later give rise to legends that the Nazis were searching for an entrance to Shambhala, the secret knowledge of ancient civilizations, and so on.
But that was still a long way off. In 1932, a 32-year-old German climber named Willy Merkel led the first German expedition to Nanga Parbat. He was a man with a fire in his eyes and an iron will. For him, this mountain became an obsession, his life's purpose. The plan for this expedition had been in development since 1930, but there was one problem. Kashmir, then part of British India, remained a highly restricted region. For the local population, the mountains are sacred, considered the abode of the gods. To disturb their peace is to invite a curse. No one was in a hurry to let foreigners in. Even today, access to some peaks is forbidden. Religious and cultural barriers can sometimes be higher than any mountain. Therefore, for 2 years, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs worked on establishing contacts, negotiating, promising, and persuading. In the end, permission was granted, but with serious restrictions that essentially doomed the original plan. The Kashmir authorities did not grant permission to approach Nanga Parbat from the north, the Diamir side, where the route was better known and relatively safer. Instead, permission was given for an approach through the Rocky Out Valley from the southern, unexplored side, a territory where no European had ever set foot. Moreover, not along the caravan routes along the Indus the traders had used for centuries, but through impassable valleys where every step could be fatal. This significantly increased the time needed to reach the base of the peak. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. These restrictions sharply reduced the number of possible routes and led to the loss of precious time. In the mountains, time isn't just a schedule.
It's the difference between life and death. Miss the right weather window, and the expedition is over. Furthermore, the Germans had relied on local residents as guides and porters. They assumed that the Kashmiris would be as hardy as Sherpas, since they lived in the mountains. The logic seems sound. Mountain people are mountain people. But reality proved different, and this became one of the expedition's main mistakes. The locals were not prepared for work at altitude. They managed at base camp level, but problems began above 3,500 meters. They suffered from altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, and a weakness that literally drained the strength from their bodies. They were extremely superstitious. Every rockfall, every gust of wind seemed to them a sign from the gods, and they often simply abandoned their work, returning to their villages in the middle of the night, leaving their loads wherever they lay. There were numerous problems with them.
Organizing their work was almost impossible. Finally, after weeks of grueling travel, the expedition reached the foot of Nanga Parbat and set up a base camp at an altitude of 3,967 meters in a place Merkel called the Fairy Meadow. And it truly was beautiful, a flat, wind-sheltered area with a view of the glaciers. Here they could rest and recover before the assault. Over the course of July, by establishing intermediate camps, the climbers managed to forge a route to a place called the Silver Saddle at an altitude of 6,850 meters. The work was hellish. Every meter of elevation was gained with blood and sweat. Hands were rubbed raw by the ropes, lungs burned from the lack of oxygen, and muscles refused to obey. But they pushed on, step by step. This is a distinctive saddle in the eastern ridge, through which the path leads to the pre-summit ridge and the summit itself. From here, the goal was a short distance by mountain standards, but an infinite one in terms of human strength. On July 29th, Willy Merkel set up a tent on the saddle and developed a plan for the summit assault. Everything was ready. The route was set, the gear was in place, the team was in shape. All that remained was to wait for good weather and go up. Triumph seemed inevitable. And, as often happens in the mountains, the weather turned abruptly. Without warning, suddenly, like a knife in the back. Due to the long approach, problems with porters, and logistical difficulties, too much time had been lost. The monsoon season had begun, the very period when the Himalayas become deadly. Storms battered the mountain. The sky turned black, the wind roared, and the snow fell in a solid wall. The porters insisted it was a curse from the gods, that they were angered by the intrusion of strangers, and that they needed to leave immediately before it was too late. Panic began to spread through the camp like a disease. In the end, the expedition had to be called off. To retreat, having fallen just short of the goal. It was bitter, but sensible. Willy Merkel returned to Germany with a finished plan, an established route, and a huge amount of work already done. All he had to do was return and finish what he had started. He knew the mountain. He knew its character, its weak spots. The next time would be different. The next time would be victorious. Or so he thought. And 2 years later, in 1934, he arrived again at Nanga Parbat with a new expedition, which will be the focus of our story. An expedition that would go down in the history of mountaineering as one of the most tragic. It was magnificently described by a participant in those events, the climber Fritz Bechtold. His memoirs are not a dry report, but the living testimony of a man who went through hell. When Nanga Parbat forced us to retreat in 1932, Willy Merkel immediately began to develop a plan for a new offensive. He could not accept defeat. Wherever he went, he sought supporters and assembled an expedition that was larger and stronger than the previous one. It became his obsession. He selected 9 climbers for the team: Peter Aschenbrenner, Fritz Bechtold, Willy Bernard, the expedition doctor, Alfred Drexel, Peter Mühlritter, Erwin Schneider, Willy Welzenbach, Uli Wieland, and Willy Merkel himself. Each of them was a master of his craft, an experienced climber with dozens of ascents under his belt. In England, where conquering the world's highest peak, Everest, is considered a national task, a matter of national pride, the idea of a mountaineering expedition of this scale fell on fertile ground. Both there and in India, Merkel found support from influential people in both political and mountaineering circles. Connections worked. Doors opened. For example, permission was obtained from the government of Kashmir to enter territory that would normally be off-limits to Europeans. This significantly shortened the long approach to the mountain. What had taken months last time could now be done in weeks. Thus, the expedition avoided the lengthy route taken in 1932 across 3 snow-covered ranges of 4,000 meters to reach the Rocky Oat Valley. Kilometers of deadly terrain were a thing of the past. Our first expedition to Nanga Parbat suffered time and again from the unreliability of the local porters. It was a nightmare. So this time we recruited 35 Sherpa porters in Darjeeling, and it was the right decision. These men belonged to an elite corps of porters, trained in mountain craft and discipline by British expeditions to Everest and German expeditions to Kangchenjunga. They knew what altitude was. They knew how to work in the thin air, how to conserve energy, how to belay each other. They were professionals of the highest class. It was fascinating to observe the solemnity with which this elite corps displayed their certificates of ascents on various peaks. They would pull out their worn papers, carefully preserved, and unfold them like sacred relics. All the famous names of the Himalayas appeared as signatories on their documents. Everest, Kangchenjunga, Makalu. The list was impressive. When, at the conclusion of negotiations, Merkel appeared in Darjeeling and hired all 35 men, their joy knew no bounds. For them, it was not just a job, it was an honor. The assault plan had been developed the previous year and tested in practice.
Every step was calculated, every detail thought out. Everything indicated that this ascent should be a triumph for German mountaineering. A flag on the summit, fame, recognition. It all seemed so close. However, despite the approval of the British government, 2 British officers, Captain Sangster and Captain Freyer, were assigned to the expedition.
officially to ensure safety and compliance with regulations, unofficially, perhaps, to ensure the Germans weren't up to anything. Politics infiltrated even the mountains. Let's return to Bechtolds' text. Our 570 loads were transported up the Jhelum River. It was a huge logistical operation. Here, 600 local porters or coolies awaited us, a whole army. In Kashmir, there are special rules for transporting goods that must be strictly observed. The actions of the coolies are clearly defined by a system that has existed for centuries. After one or more stages, it is necessary to hire new men and animals and to pay and release the previous ones.
Such is the tradition. Crossing the wintry Burzil Pass placed high demands on the porters and the entire organization. Waist-deep snow, an icy wind that chilled to the bone, narrow paths above chasms. On May 7th, we overcame this most difficult obstacle in the approach to the peak. When the pass was behind us, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The rest of the journey was completed more easily and with fewer difficulties, though it could hardly be called easy. On May 13th, we left the wild, rocky gorges of the mountains and descended into the flat, sandy basin of the Indus. The contrast was striking. Instead of vertical walls, a flat plain. Instead of the roar of rock falls, the sound of the river. We crossed the Indus before the snowmelt began, when the river had not yet turned into a raging torrent. It was here that we first saw Nanga Parbat. Slowly, the mighty ice wall emerged from the clouds. The moment was almost mystical. The distant mountain shone like silver, floating in the air, unreal, unattainable, and everyone knew that it had taken hold of them. From that moment on, their thoughts were only of it. We reached it very quickly. Only 4 weeks had passed since leaving Munich. Compared to the last expedition, this was a fantastic speed. Since we intended, as in 1932, to attack Nanga Parbat from its safest and easiest flank, the northeastern side, we ascended a narrow trail. The word safe here is of course relative. The mountain seemed to be awakening from its winter sleep, and huge ice avalanches constantly thundered down into the valley with a roar like thunder. Every such roar made you flinch and look around to see if it was coming for you. At the edge of the snow, the local coolies were paid and released, and 40 new ones were hired. The rotation continued. On May 25, when the first convoy reached the main camp after great difficulty due to deep snow that sometimes came up to their chests, the first breach was made in the mountain's defenses. The way up was open. Other transport parties followed, bringing up gear, food, tents, everything needed for life at altitude. And on May 27, the first assault on the mountain began. The real work had started. The advance party, consisting of Aschenbrenner, Drexel, Schneider, and Welsenbach with 16 porters from Darjeeling, was tasked with finding a path through the wild crevices of the Rakyat Glacier to Camp 4 and setting up the first few tents. To break trail means to go first, to risk the most, to make decisions on the fly. From below, from the glacier, the mighty realm of Nanga Parbat suddenly reveals itself. When you stand at its base and look up, it takes your breath away. High above, the first glimmer of light flashes. The sun touches the summit. Slowly, the dazzling splendor flows down the slopes, turning ice into gold. And across 4,000 meters of massive wall to the glacier below, the first avalanches break free from its icy slopes, a reminder that the mountain is alive and dangerous. Looking up at the mountain is like looking at something unreal. The scale is impossible to comprehend. But while it can overwhelm a person, it can also elevate them. Here, you feel both insignificant and omnipotent. The first assault was favored by magnificent weather and excellent snow conditions. It was as if the mountain was giving them a chance. Despite the hard work and numerous false trails among the ice chasms and crevasses where one wrong step meant the end, the advance party made rapid progress. The pace was good. Camps 1 and 2 were established in almost the same locations as in 1932, familiar territory. Parties of porters climbed up daily with supplies, working like ants, methodically, without stopping. They were in the best shape.
Acclimatization had been successful, and no one complained about their health. It seemed everything indicated that Camp 4 would be established and supplied with provisions within a few days. The plan was working like clockwork. But then a terrible blow of fate broke their enthusiasm. On the evening of June 7th, Alfred Drexel, who had been feeling unwell since morning, returned to Camp 2 suffering from a severe headache. At first, no one paid it much attention. A high-altitude headache is a common thing. That same night, his condition worsened dramatically. He began to have trouble breathing, became delirious, and lost consciousness. Messengers were rushed down for help. All the expedition's resources were deployed to save his life. Men ran through the darkness on dangerous paths, risking their own lives. On the afternoon of June 8th, Bernard, the expedition doctor, arrived at Camp 2, breathless from the rapid ascent. But it was too late. At 10:20 p.m., Drexel died of pneumonia in the arms of his comrades. He was gasping, struggling to breathe, gulping for air with his mouth, and then he went still. With Alfred Drexel, the expedition lost a first-rate climber, strong, experienced, reliable. His death shocked everyone. The assault on the mountain was postponed to give their comrade a proper burial. Piety and reason dictated a solemn funeral. Without it, the porters would undoubtedly have never left the camp. For them it was a sign of the gods' anger. And the organization of an assault on an 8,000-meter peak requires that all lines of communication be in order. Any panic could destroy the entire expedition. The climber's grave was prepared on a moraine hill above the main camp, under the blue light of the eternal snows. They cut stones, built a pyramid, and installed a plaque. Nanga Parbat itself watches over his deep slumber.
He would remain here forever. Of course, the death of a team member somewhat undermined the expedition's morale, but it cannot be said that they were unprepared for it. Death in the mountains is a reality they all accepted. In those years, it was common for not everyone to return from such expeditions. Losses were seen as an inevitable price for achievement. An ascent of an 8,000er where no one died would have been the exception to the rule. Tragedy was the norm. The author writes that Alfred died of pneumonia, although based on the symptoms, sudden deterioration, suffocation, loss of consciousness, it was most likely an acute form of altitude sickness. The lack of oxygen could have caused pulmonary edema, where fluid fills the alveoli and the person essentially drowns in their own lungs. It is rapid, agonizing, and almost irreversible at such an altitude. In those years, climbing with oxygen was not yet very popular.
Oxygen cylinders were not mandatory equipment, and German climbers in particular viewed ascents with supplemental oxygen with some contempt. They considered it a crutch for weak climbers. A true man should conquer a peak with his own lungs, such was the philosophy. But if they had had an oxygen cylinder with them, and if the victim had been given oxygen in time, he could most likely have been saved. It would have been enough to stabilize his condition and bring him down urgently. But in those days, very little was known about the effects of altitude on the human body. Mountain medicine was just beginning to develop, and every expedition was, in essence, an experiment. Resuming the struggle with the mountain became a common goal. They had to move on. The reliable Darjeeling porters gave a wonderful proof of their loyalty. Some of them, in their attempts to save Drexel's life, did the work of 3 or 4 days in just 24 hours.
They ran down and back up with loads, without sleep or food, working at their absolute limit. They could be relied upon completely. With the new assault, everyone knew they would work hard and willingly. The Sherpas would not let them down. At this time, a messenger brought news of a delay in the arrival of the tsampa supplies. The logistical problems had not gone away. Tsampa, or tsampa, is a national food of the Tibetans. In essence, it is simply roasted ground barley flour. It sounds simple, but its importance is hard to overstate. In some regions, tsampa constitutes almost the entire diet of Tibetans. They eat nothing else, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Their bodies are adapted to this food. A dish of the same name is made from tsampa. This roasted ground barley flour is taken and mixed with yak butter, a rich, thick butter with a pungent smell. Green tea is also added, and the mixture is covered with water.
The result is a very high-calorie porridge that coats the stomach and provides energy for hours. On holidays, it might be brewed with beer and have dried fruits like raisins or apricots added. Then it becomes almost a delicacy. Overall, it is an extremely high-calorie, long-lasting, and lightweight product, the ideal food for the mountains. And it is very versatile. If you add more water, you get a soup or tea that can be drunk on the go. If you add less water, you get a thick porridge eaten with a spoon. If you add even less water, you get a dough for flatbreads, which are baked on coals or hot stones. It is a very versatile and nutritious food, so the Tibetans would not go anywhere without it. To give up tsampa is to be left without strength. And another non-obvious point, tsampa was part of many Buddhist rituals. It is not just food, it is a sacred substance. For example, tsampa is thrown during funerals to release the soul of the deceased and help it find its way.
And on the assault of Nanga Parbat's summit, this ritual might yet come in handy, unfortunately. But let's return to the climber's account. Our route, chosen in 1932 to the summit ridge of Nanga Parbat via a steep 800-meter wall, which was then called the Mulde, or Trough, was impassable in 1934 due to the threat of avalanches. The snow cover had changed. Conditions were different. We also sought to get out of the sun-drenched snow basins and onto the open, safer ridge as quickly as possible. Avalanches posed a very great threat. They came down without warning at any moment. If the new plan, of which Aschenbrenner was the most ardent supporter, succeeded, they would soon reach the 6th Intermediate Camp. It was a cunning route, but a promising one. The only question was whether a safe route for the porters could be established over Rakhiot Peak, a steep, icy, technically difficult section. On July 1st, the start was given. The entire camp was breathing with the desire for the assault. People woke up with fire in their eyes, checking their gear, putting on crampons, tying knots. The energy was palpable. It was very cold. The thermometer inside the tent showed minus 13 degrees Celsius. Outside, it was even worse. As for acclimatization at altitude, the 500-meter difference between Camp 4 and Camp 5 was a significant leap. The body reacted sharply. Movement became slower. Every step required effort. The pauses for breath between steps grew longer. Inhale, exhale, step. Again, inhale, exhale, step. A steep, exposed path led up snow slopes where the wind knocked you off your feet. And it was here that Lapsang, one of the strongest porters who had not complained about anything before, unfortunately fell ill and was sent down. His face took on a gray hue and he began to stumble. An escort had to be sent with him. Camp 5 was established at an altitude of 6,690 meters. Here, the air is already very thin, and breathing is difficult even at rest. It was located so close to the base of Rakhiot Peak that after a thorough rest, everyone was ready to attack the difficult wall. The goal was near. Aschenbrenner, Schneider, and Welsenbach attacked the ice wall of Rakiet Peak. Watching them from below was a sight both amazing and alarming. They looked like flies on the steep wall, tiny dots on a huge vertical expanse as they drove in their ice screws, blow by blow, metal ringing against ice and fixed ropes. Every movement was calculated, with no rush. The entire wall had to be equipped with a secure rope ladder so that one could descend safely if the weather turned. This was an insurance policy, without which the ascent would be suicide. The work was hellish. Hands froze, the rope burned the palms, and one had to hang by one arm while driving in a screw with the other. Slowly, they approached a break in the rocky northern ridge of Rakiet Peak, which still hid the view of the route to the summit. The suspense remained.
Finally, they sat down on the sunny rocks and breathed freely. The rock was warm, a rarity at such an altitude. But their first glance was not at the mighty bastion of Nanga Parbat's summit, but at the long traverse that led to the snowy ridge of the Silver Saddle. The route had to be assessed. It seemed there were no major difficulties. The slope looked passable. They set to work securing the steep wall with ropes. Such work at altitude is terribly difficult and exhausting. Every hammer blow echoes in your temples. Every breath burns your lungs. When they finished, 600 feet of rope hung on the steep face of Rakiot, almost 180 meters of safety line. With its help, they descended quickly and reached the camp, tired but very satisfied. The job was done. On the magnificent morning of July 4, Merkel woke the entire camp early and gave the final instructions for the start. His voice sounded confident. The plan was clear.
Schneider and Aschenbrenner, unburdened by packs and porters, traveling light, were to prepare the traverse across the west face of Rakiot Peak. To go first, to check for safety. At certain intervals, Merkel, Welsenbach, Wieland, and I followed them with 17 porters. The caravan stretched out along the slope. Some of the porters had never been on such a steep ice wall before. For them, it was their first experience of such difficulty. The route across it was certainly the limit of what loaded men could handle, with packs of 15-20 kilograms on their backs, but everything went perfectly. If you glanced back for a moment, you could see the smiling and eager faces of these men. They were coping, proud of themselves. On the ridge above was a section of the route that demanded the greatest care and attention. Below the exposed ice cliffs, the wall dropped steeply to the upper glacier surface of Camp 6, hundreds of meters of sheer drop. One wrong step meant the end.
The vanguard, meanwhile, had fixed ropes here, anchoring them to reliable points. Slowly we approached the flat snow saddle where the famous Camp 7 of 1932 had stood, the place where they had to turn back and descend last time, the site of defeat. Thus, the highest altitude ever reached on Nanga Parbat by humans had been attained, a record, and beyond it lay only the summit, uncharted territory. There it was, within arm's reach, just a few hundred vertical meters away. But these few hundred meters are one of the most technically challenging sections in mountaineering. Every meter is a test. And while they set up tents here, driving in stakes, stretching tarps, Nanga Parbat slowly revealed its icy splendor. The sun was setting. From the waves of the sea of fog below, the peaks of 5,000ers began to emerge, looking truly small from here, like hills on the horizon. Perspective shifted. The porters stopped their work, and along with everyone else, gazed at this wonderful mountain.
The moment was magical. Silence, beauty, a sense of being close to something great. After Rakiot Peak, the mountain's most difficult challenge had fallen. The conquest of Nanga Parbat seemed a matter of only 3 or 4 days. Optimism was high. The summit seemed almost guaranteed. The weather, which for several days had regularly offered a magnificent morning, a short midday fog, and a splendid evening, seemed most favorable for the assault. Stability is the best gift in the mountains. Surprisingly, everyone slept excellently, despite the cramped conditions inside the tent, lying shoulder to shoulder, and the great altitude. The body had adapted. But the morning did not bring a joyful awakening. 3 of the best porters reported that they were suffering from altitude sickness and asked for permission to descend without an escort. Headaches, nausea, weakness. The first alarm bell. The porter situation became even more precarious when, the next day at Camp 7, at an altitude of 7,105 meters, 2 others began to collapse from illness. Literally, they would lose their balance and slump onto the snow. They were so exhausted that it was with great difficulty that they were brought down to the camp, dragged by the arms, almost carried. The exhaustion of a porter named Norbu was like a complete collapse and lasted for 2 days. He lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his pulse faint. It seems the man fell into a coma due to altitude sickness, which caused cerebral edema. Fluid was filling his skull, compressing the brain. But because he was brought down fairly quickly to where there was more oxygen, his condition stabilized, and he survived. Every 100 meters down is a chance. Let's return to the account. When I left Camp 7 on July 6th, it was a magnificent, clear morning. The sky was blue, cloudless, the sun bright. However, Bernard later told me that bad weather had been raging at Camp 4 for several days. Snow, wind, 0 visibility, while the sun shone on the ridge above. The mountain was creating an illusion of well-being. There was not the slightest fear for the advance party. On the contrary, everyone was convinced that the summit would be taken on July 7th. Triumph seemed inevitable. On July 6th, Aschenbrenner, Schneider, Welsenbach, Merkel, and Wieland, with 11 porters, reached the Silver Saddle at an altitude of 7,451 meters, almost there. While Merkel, with Wieland and the porters, stayed a little behind setting up camp, Aschenbrenner and Schneider, in a strong wind, gusts knocking them off their feet, ascended the plateau to move Camp 8 closer to the summit and find a spot sheltered from the wind. They looked for cover behind a rock in a hollow. The sight of the clear, unencumbered path to the summit filled them with even more joy. The route looked passable. They estimated they were about 4 or 5 hours' climb from the main summit, just a few hours to the goal. Despite the blue sky, the storm had strengthened significantly by evening and turned into a ferocious hurricane during the night. It was unclear where it had come from, as if the mountain had decided to punish them for their overconfidence. The large tent housing Merkel, Welzenbach, and Wieland was bent completely in half by the terrible gusts of wind. The fabric was tearing, the poles were bending, and it seemed the tent was about to be ripped apart. Only the next morning did they manage to secure it again with ropes, tying them to ice axes driven into the snow. A blizzard beat incessantly against the tent walls, and snow forced its way into every crack. But the climbers believed the weather would improve. It was temporary. The packs for the summit assault remained ready. They contained little, but everything essential. A flag for the summit, a camera for proof, and something to eat. Chocolate, dried fruit. However, on July 7th, the storm broke out with such force that the advance party had to take shelter in their tents again and abandon their plans to conquer the summit. It was impossible to go outside. At a furious speed, thick clouds of wind-blown snow swept over the plateau and hid the sun, so that at 10 o'clock in the morning it was as dark as night. Visibility was 0, a whiteout. The porters felt relatively safe in their tents, and no one suffered from the piercing cold. The sleeping bags held the heat.
Nevertheless, the terrible storm prevented them from preparing even the simplest food, although those besieged by the weather actually had enough provisions for 5 or 6 days. It was impossible to light the Primus stove. The wind extinguished the flame instantly. The hurricane intensified with each hour. The sound was like a jet engine. A second terrible night in the camp passed as it raged. No one slept. The tents shook, snow piled up, and fear grew. The morning of July 8th brought no improvement in the weather. The storm showed no signs of abating. Existence in the tent became almost unbearable. The cold seeped in despite their gear. There was no food and nothing to drink. Now everyone agreed that the first summit attempt had failed, so Merkel gave the order to descend to Camp 4. They had to leave. The climbers divided into 2 groups. Aschenbrenner and Schneider were to go ahead with the Sherpas Pasang, Nima Dorje, and Pinjo Norbu to break a path in the deep snow, to forge a trail and pack it down. The second group, which included Merkel, Welsenbach, and Wieland, was to follow them immediately with the other porters. The interval was about 20 minutes. At the time of the descent, the group's condition was quite normal.
They were, of course, battered by these nights in the hurricane-force wind. Their faces were wind-burned, lips chapped, eyes inflamed. But they did not see this as a retreat from the mountain. It was a tactical withdrawal. They intended to return for another summit attempt as soon as the weather improved. But the storm was not about to subside. It was just beginning. Through the hurricane-force wind, with visibility of only 10 meters, the climbers, who were exhausted by the difficult nights, began their descent. Every step was a risk. Schneider went first, probing the ground with his ice axe. The porters followed, tied to a single rope, with Aschenbrenner bringing up the rear of the first group, ready to belay his comrades at any moment if they fell. The rope was pulled taut, the only connection between them in the whiteout. At one point, the Sherpa Nima Dorji was snatched from the steps by the storm. A gust of wind knocked him over like a rag doll.
He screamed, trying to get a hold, but he flew downwards. Only with enormous effort did Pasang and Aschenbrenner manage to hold him on the rope. They fell to the snow, braced themselves with their ice axes, and the rope strained to its limit, thus saving their entire group from death. If the rope had broken, they would have all fallen in a chain. However, during the fall, the Sherpa lost his backpack, which contained their sleeping bags. The strap broke. Like a large balloon, the big backpack flew into the abyss, disappearing into the snowy haze. A second later, it was gone. The 5 men now had only one sleeping bag, and so it became absolutely necessary to reach either the 5th or the 4th camp that same day if they did not want to freeze to death that night. A night without sleeping bags at such an altitude is death. Slow, agonizing, but inevitable. Thus, the climbers divided into 2 groups. The first consisted of 2 Europeans and 3 Sherpas, who were breaking the snow and forging the path, the hardest work. The second included 3 Europeans and the remaining Sherpas and porters, following the established trail. In this snowstorm, the blizzard allowed visibility of no more than 10 meters, a white wall. The first group lost their way several times, wandered and turned back, losing precious time and energy. Every mistake cost minutes of life. To spare the porters who were carrying heavy loads from having to search for the route, Aschenbrenner and Schneider untied from their rope team and went ahead lightly packed, telling the porters to follow in their tracks. Follow us, don't turn aside. After superhuman efforts, they pushed through as if through a wall, snow beating their faces, their breathing ragged. Schneider and Aschenbrenner, completely exhausted and covered in ice from head to toe, reached the safety of Camp 4.
They stumbled into the tent and collapsed on the floor, unable to speak. The 2 German climbers were saved.
But still on the mountain were 3 porters from their group, and Merkel's entire group, which was following behind. Where were they? Why hadn't they arrived? We waited at Camp 4 all evening and all night. We stared into the blizzard, listening, but Willie Merkel and his men never came. It was only much later that it was possible to reconstruct the events that took place on the mountain during those terrible hours. It is easy to get confused here. First, the text of one of the climbers will be quoted, and then an attempt will be made to decipher it and understand what really happened. So, the Sherpas, Pasang, Nima Dorji, and Pinjo Norbu went no further than Camp 7, where they spent the night in a tent left earlier. They simply did not have the strength to go on. Merkel's group's situation was even worse, as they had to make camp below the Silver Saddle without a tent at all.
An open bivouac in a hurricane-force wind. How it happened that the comrades with the porters covered such a short distance will never be understood. Something went wrong from the very beginning. The only 4 brave porters from the old group who returned alive said that Merkel and Wieland were unable to go any further. Their legs simply refused to move. The suffering caused by the terrible bivouac on the night of the 8th in the raging blizzard led to a rapid exhaustion of strength, which prevented most of the main group from reaching the safety of the lower camps. The body began to shut down. Sherpa Nima Norbu died that same night during the open bivouac. He simply froze, stopped breathing, and in the morning, Merkel's right hand and both of Wieland's hands were frostbitten. Their fingers turned black and would not bend. During the descent on July 9th, Sherpas Angtsering, Gele, and Dakshi were forced to remain on the mountain as they were partly ill and partly snowblind.
Snowblindness is when the eyes become inflamed from reflected light and a person can see nothing but a white veil. The climber, Ulia Wieland, died that same morning, just 30 meters short of the Camp 7th tent. He literally saw the tent, reached for it, fell, and did not get up. Merkel and Welzenbach were left alone in this camp, while the Sherpas Kitar, Dayton, Nimatashi, and Kikuli descended further. On their way across the ridge, they were chest-deep in snow. Every step was like wading through a swamp. This storm was so terrible that they could not reach the camp and were forced to take shelter in a snow cave they dug with their hands. A cave was better than the open. Now for an attempt to decipher this text to make it clearer. The events are confusing, there are many people, and it's easy to lose the thread. So let's sort this out in order. The group turned back down from Camp 8, located just below the Silver Saddle. This was the starting point.
The 2 lead German climbers, Schneider and Aschenbrenner, broke away from their 3 porters between Camp 8 and Camp 7 and successfully descended all the way to Camp 4, passing several intermediate camps. They were saved. Strong and experienced, they made it through. Their 3 Sherpas, Pasang, Nima Dorje, and Pinjo Norbu, could not go further than Camp 7 and spent the night there in a previously abandoned tent. They reached shelter, which was something. But what about the second group, Merkel's group? For some unknown reason, their progress was extremely slow. Perhaps they were already exhausted. Perhaps they lost their bearings in the blizzard. This group included 3 Europeans, Merkel, Welzenbach, and Wieland, and the remaining Sherpas, about 8 men. They were unable to descend even to Camp 7 and were forced to spend the night without a tent between Camp 8 and Camp 7, simply on the snow in sleeping bags, huddled together.
The hurricane howled. The temperature dropped. In the morning, one of the Sherpas, Nima Norbu, died from the cold. He was found motionless, frozen. The rest of this group were severely frostbitten, exhausted, and suffering from altitude sickness, a deadly combination. And 3 porters, Ang Sering, Gale and Dakshi could not continue, as they were blinded by the snow and too exhausted to walk. They were left simply in the middle of the mountain between Camp 7 and Camp 8, alive but immobile. In the morning, the remaining 3 Europeans and 4 porters from this group started towards Camp 7. They were trying to save themselves. Unfortunately, one of the Europeans, Uli Wieland, died just a few meters short of the Camp 7 tent. He saw his goal, but his strength ran out. He fell face down in the snow. The tent was too small for such a large group, 2 tents for several people, and besides, they needed to keep descending. They couldn't stop.
The Europeans, Merkel and Welzenbach, remained in the tent at Camp 7. By then, both Merkel and Welzenbach were very severely frostbitten. Their hands had turned into pieces of dead flesh. They could only walk by leaning on 2 ice axes, as if on crutches, as their hands had stopped functioning. They couldn't hold anything. The 4 Sherpas, Kitar, Dayton, Nimatashi, and Kikuli, were forced to leave for Camp 6 without the Europeans, to leave them behind. But, falling short of the camp by a few meters, they collapsed from exhaustion and spent the night in a snow cave they had somehow managed to dig, just a few meters from the tents and safety. So close, and yet so far. Meanwhile, the 3 Sherpas from the first group, the ones who had spent the night at Camp 7, had already descended to Camp 6 that morning. They had the strength. Thus, on the morning of July 10th, the Sherpas from the cave and from Camp 6 met. 7 men, those who could still walk. They began a joint descent.
It was safer as a group. Let's return to the climber's text. On July 10th, a day of storm, 7 people were spotted from Camp 4, descending the ice wall of Rokyat Peak. They were the surviving Sherpas, silhouettes in the blizzard. An attempt was made to go out to help them, but further progress again became impossible because they were sinking in impassable snow. The snow was waist deep. It was impossible to walk. Of the 7, only 4 made it down: Pasong, Kitar, Kikuli, and Tadun. The others perished on the way. Their comrades Nimatashi and Nimadorje died after falling on the ropes from Rokyat Peak. They were tired, lost their grip, and plunged into the abyss, and Sherpa Tinjo Norbu died 3 meters from the tents of the safe Camp V. His heart gave out, right on the threshold of salvation. The 4 brave survivors were completely exhausted. They were at the limit of their strength, barely able to stand. All 4 had severely frostbitten hands and feet.
The skin was black, blistered, the tissue dead. Bernhard carefully gave them some soup, warm, salty, and then each took a porter by the arm and gently led him to Camp 4, step by step, supporting them. For the entire first half of the night, they rubbed their frostbitten fingers and toes. They massaged them, trying to restore circulation, although they knew that many fingers could no longer be saved. Finally, at midnight, Kitar had recovered enough to be able to tell about the terrible days of the storm they had endured on the ridge. His voice trembled. His words were jumbled. On the night of July 11th, poor Dakshi died above Camp 7. His body was found later, frozen.
The next morning, his companions Gale and Angsering descended to Camp 7, where they met Merkel and Welzenbach. 2 blind men and 2 frostbitten men. And every morning, for a few minutes when the storm clouds parted, they could see the rescue party ascending from Camp 6, tiny figures moving upwards. They did not know how the rescue team was constantly being driven back by the storm and deep snow, how the rescuers were trying to break through but could not. So they waited in quiet hope that help would come. They looked down, waited, and believed. Willie Welzenbach died on the night of July 13th in Camp 7. He simply did not wake up. His body remained in his sleeping bag. On the morning of the 14th,
The last survivors, Merkel and the two Sherpas, descended towards Camp 6. Merkel trudged with difficulty, leaning on two ice axes that he held as best he could with his frost-bitten hands. Every step was agony. On the ascent, there was a small rise before the camp. His strength ran out.
It was simply gone. Here they built themselves a small ice cave. They dug a hole in the snow. This was the end. From below, at Camp 4, a person could be seen making his way across the saddle. A single figure, moving slowly. From time to time, the storm carried cries for help, faint, intermittent. The lone figure reached Rakiet Peak and descended. It was Sherpa Antsering, Willie Merkel's assistant, who, finally, completely exhausted and suffering from terrible frostbite, found refuge in Camp 6. With superhuman endurance, he had fought his way down through the storm and snow, blind, frostbitten, but alive. Since he brought no letter from Merkel, there was no strength to write. His simple story was the last news of the heroic struggle of his comrades and their loyal porters high on the ridge. Now, let's break down this last passage to make everything perfectly clear. So, 3 Sherpas, Antsering, Gayle, and Dakshi, were left between Camp 7 and Camp 8 after going snowblind.
On the morning of July 11th, one of them, Dakshi, died of exhaustion and cold. The 2 remaining, Gayle and Antsering, descended to Camp 7, where they found the 2 Europeans, Merkel and Welsenbach. Exhausted, frostbitten, they looked down through brief clearings in the storm and saw the rescue team trying to break through to them, and they waited for help for several days. Hope was still alive, but help did not arrive. The storm wouldn't allow it. On the morning of the 13th, the European Welsenbach died. One of Germany's best climbers perished in a tent at an altitude of 7,105 meters. The remaining survivors, Willie Merkel and the 2 Sherpas, Gayle and Antsering, tried to descend themselves, a last attempt. But on the descent, Merkel's strength failed him. He was physically unable to go on, and Merkel and the Sherpa Gayle remained in a snow cave above Camp V. Gayle did not want to abandon his leader. And only Sherpa Antsering, mustering his remaining strength, managed to descend and was miraculously saved on July 15th. He reached Camp 6 and then Camp 4, the sole survivor from Merkel's group. But rescue attempts continued as long as there was the slightest hope. On July 15th and 16th, Schneider and Aschenbrenner, casting aside common sense and the instinct for self-preservation, tried to break through to Camp 5 to try to save their comrades. They knew it was almost suicide, but they couldn't just sit there. But it was in vain. They were driven back by the storm. Snow and wind made progress impossible. On July 17th, Rahel and Mish, having returned to base camp from their scientific tour around Nanga Parbat, made a final rescue attempt. Fresh forces, but they too failed. The mountain would not let them pass. The weather remained bad. The storm raged day after day. The last cry from above fell silent. There were no more signs of life. Willie Merkel and his loyal porter Gayle perished.
Merkel, one of the best climbers of his generation, a man who had dreamed of Nanga Parbat for years, remained on the mountain forever. And Sherpa Gayle could have actually descended with his comrade Antsering. He still had the strength, but he did not want to leave Willie Merkel alone in the snow cave, and also died on the mountain. Loyalty to the end. This is what their comrades wrote about it. It was impossible to even think of a further summit attempt, or even of trying to reach our dead. The storm did not cease. We could not give them a coffin, could not bury them properly, but in our hearts they will remain forever. Such is the story of the attempt to climb Nanga Parbat in 1934. The mountain remained unconquered, but it took 9 lives, 4 German climbers and 5 Sherpas, 9 people who wanted to reach the summit and did not return.